Hello everyone, we are back on YouTube and LinkedIn with our live podcast on the Top Innovator Series. This is where we dive into proven leadership ideas, game-changing strategies, and of course the brilliant minds behind all of that. I'm Josef Martens, your host, and I'm thrilled to introduce today's guest to you. With us today is David Emerson. David is the CTO of SolCyber Managed Security Services. He has also filled CIO and deputy CISO roles for other organizations in the past. And of course, leading up to that, he held other senior leadership roles in various organizations. And today we are thrilled to have David with us. David, it's great to have you here.
Good to be here. That's a high pressure intro.
Let's turn it right back into relaxed mode. Let's talk about leadership and take everything about titles, roles, and so out of the mix here. When you think of your clearly successful leadership progression, what would you attribute that success to? So what are some of the ingredients? What are some of the reasons? What are some of the tools that you've used to got to where you are today?
The teams I've worked with. I mean that in a non-saccharine, it's not a contrivance or anything. It's the teams that you've worked with, and then as a leader, the teams that you build and curate and work with again and again.
Okay, awesome. So follow-up question is obvious. How do you build those teams? How do you get to those teams? What have you learned? What did not work at some point? What are some of the ways that you create those teams for you?
Yeah, so they're created actively. I would say that the first kind of ingredient for success is scale, which isn't always intrinsic, right? It's not easy to say, oh, start at a large company or start at a medium-sized company, but you will have an easier time curating a team if you have flexibility in the numbers, right? If you have a scale that permits you to say, this is good performance, this is not good performance, this is who I like to work with, this is who I don't like to work with. And in my career, at least, I have had that. I especially had that at the beginning of my career, to the extent that I was able to work on larger teams, to work with enough personnel to be able to form opinions. It is much, much harder starting from a small team to not only form opinions, but have the flexibility to deal with something if there is a problem, to curate the team, to make meaningful change at scale. And so I guess I say it to make people aware of the difficulty of working with and managing a small team to success, especially when you're a junior in management, especially when you're kind of new, versus the flexibility and really degrees of freedom intrinsic to a larger team that you can influence.
Yeah. How do you know that you have a good team? What are some of the indicators for that? I'm especially thinking of leading indicators. Now, of course, results need to get produced, but that's a lagging indicator. So are there any leading indicators that you look at and they give you an indication, this is good, this is working as a team?
Yeah. So conscientiousness as a personality trait really, really strongly correlates with success in the workplace. And I would say that from a management perspective, if you're not giving personality index or inventories or batteries to your team, you probably wouldn't necessarily be able to pick that out. And so the best indicator you have at that point is, some kind of self-actualization. You're feeling that people feel empowered and capable to affect the trajectory of their work. I think that is probably the strongest leading indicator to me of somebody that I want to work with, is someone who isn't simply going to do the role that is assigned to them by the numbers, by the order, but do that role. And as that role is necessarily expanding into neighboring roles, do those roles as well, or influence those roles themselves. Because that's the only way this works at scale, at any rational level of sophistication, is if everybody is pulling weight at a granular individual contributor level. And so I would say the indicator is self-actualization. You really want to see teammates who feel empowered. And so you also have to empower them, right? But you really want to see teammates who feel empowered, and you want to hire people who feel a duty that is well beyond what literally their job description reads.
Yeah. It sounds to me that has something to do with ownership as well. To what extent do they take ownership over their role, and maybe even more, right? Maybe taking ownership over the whole business or some neighboring areas. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. Ownership is another way to put it. And of course, this comes with a management burden, which is, it isn't always appreciated when people start sticking their nose in other people's duties, right? Like there is a certain confliction that has to occur. And so I would say another personality trait you're looking for is someone who can have rational discussions, because it isn't okay to hire a bunch of rock stars who know what they're doing, who really could do many other people's jobs, and then they go around and try to do those other people's jobs in a way that just is culturally unhealthy. So there is a management burden to this. I'm not implying that this is all easy to hire people that take ownership, but there is a kind of person that takes ownership and is also capable of understanding a boundary, right? Is capable of understanding that they may have a better way to do that, but that's not their job. Maybe instead they can work on the interface between their job and that person's own performance.
Yeah, and I imagine the conflict or the leadership challenge comes in from the fact that people are beginning to compete for the same space, or they are competing for attention on something. Or what else is there, David? Where else do you think?
Management of tension. I would say that you have to be able to differentiate a healthy optimized tension from an unhealthy tension. There are many circumstances. You see this a lot in sales organizations. Not that I run sales organizations, but it's a really good example of a healthy tension, the tension between sales and engineering. Sales will sell anything that they think could make them a dime, and engineering works in the real world. They're getting down to brass tacks of what can actually be done. But would you ever put an engineer in a sales role? I don't think you'd be selling a whole lot. And would you ever put a salesperson in an engineering role? I don't think anything would work. So, these are healthy tensions. That's one that, it must be managed, but if it didn't exist, I don't really think you'd show progress.
Yeah. So. Tell me a bit about how clear that was, that what you shared here about the tension, about the ownership or the self-actualization that is important for people. Tell me a bit about how clear that was to you when you set out in your leadership journey, and to what extent you discovered this, it became clearer to you as you progressed in that. Tell me how that happened.
So my first few roles were very privileged roles. They were roles that were at organizations that either had less than a typical amount of strain or resource constraint, or places that really were just made of money, right? You work for a finance organization, and the primary concern is uptime. The primary concern is not what it costs. The primary concern is that it never go down. And what you learn in those kinds of environments is, the art of the possible, but not so much the art of the constraint. There is actually a lot more fun to be had in an environment that is constrained, when you basically can't simply define something and justify it on uptime alone. And so, as a technical feat, what I learned early on was the art of the possible, and that gave me a sense of what you could be expecting from a functioning system, from a functioning team, or from a functioning organization. And then as I moved on in my career, I took roles where there were significant constraints. They were a publicly traded company, or they were, maybe a regulated company, or they just were a lower margin business than funds. And so that sort of constraint, you realize, okay, we now know what the inventory of the possible is, but we're going to be able to achieve 5% of that at 1/10 of 1% of the cost. And that is actually a very, very, I would say, positive sort of pressure on a leader, because a young leader needs experiences. A maturing leader, really honestly needs to focus. And so that sort of focus that is provided by the absence of resources, I think is extremely healthy to encounter in mid-career, much more so than early career. If you never learn the art of the possible, if you're always at some low margin constrained place, then you may never really learn what it is you should be expecting for your dime, right?
I love that.
So I really attribute that largely to my personal satisfaction.
Yep. I love that distinction between the art of the possible and the art of managing constraints or finding a solution within constraints. That's neat. And how this makes sense in terms of the leadership progression, what might benefit the leader and at different stages. So when you look at the folks that you lead at the moment, how do you offer that opportunity to them? Right? It sounds like sort of the ideal setup. At some point we are dreaming wild, or we're looking at the universe as everything that's possible. And at some point, something else needs to kick in. Is this something that can be created by a leader? Is this something that you can bring to your team? Or is this necessary, only possible through going to a different organization or sidestepping somehow?
It can be created. It has to be created at a company that is willing to permit its creation. That excludes many companies that treat roles as machines. If you're at a company where a job description is going to be so tightly held as to preclude the possibility that it would expand in scope organically, right? Then and this would be like I'm thinking of a very large bank, let's say. That kind of organization, for many reasons that might actually be legitimate, probably isn't where you want to make your mark if you're the kind of leader that wants to build culture, that wants to build small team culture, accountable. Of accountable high-performance individuals. So I think it's especially relevant to this community because this is a community of small, medium, enterprise, and that's the scale, that's the kind of company at which not only can you not afford the sort of vast meat automation of, okay, we have these roles and we're giving them to humans who have these bounded roles, but you can't afford that because you don't have the headcount, but also you don't really want that because that's not the sort of culture you want to build. Instead, you're looking to build a culture that acknowledges the contribution of a human, that acknowledges why we even have humans working. There's an awful lot that Claude 3.7 can do when I'm looking to write some code, but the things that it can't do are enduring. They are enduring traits of a flexible being, and that is why you hire humans. You hire humans because they can, man a ship, they can change a diaper, they can cook dinner, they can do all these things that Claude 3.7 simply cannot do. You don't hire humans because they can crank out Python code all day long. Like that's not going to be a feat. At the moment, that's a transitory feat, but give it 3 years and that won't be a thing anymore. That's okay.
Fascinating. Okay. Cool. We talked about your past journey. I would like to take a look at where you are today. And again, this is not about company, not about role, title, or anything like that. It's about your leadership journey. When you look at where you are today, what do you think are some areas that you want to focus on at the moment? What are some areas where you feel I can grow here? There is room for me to do my next level leadership development.
Right now I'm at a managed security services company. It's been really interesting being in services. This is my first journey in direct services, right? Essentially, we are a security team that you didn't have to staff and tool up and whatnot. That's what my company does. And I'm head of tech and operations. And so I touch almost everything that touches the customer directly. After sales, that's kind of what hits my team. It is a very practical job, and it's one that is essentially what I've been doing, all along, just now fractionally hired out to other companies. I think my journey eventually needs to inevitably include the less practical aspect of that, marketing, sales, and so on. I do get exposure to that. I'm at a small enough company, and I've been at this company from the beginning. So, obviously it's natural that portions of that have come across my desk. But at the end of the day, that is my development journey, is getting out of the practical, right? Every day at the moment, when something hits my desk, it's a question of how does this happen in the real world? And that isn't always the concern. There are many people that actually come from the opposite perspective. I've talked to sales leaders, who have never considered whether something can be done. They've considered whether it's sellable. That really, it's just a different perspective. It's a matter of perspective, and that's a perspective I lack at the moment.
It's a completely different question to start off with. Interesting how you describe it, David, because it sounds a little bit to me like what we discussed at the beginning of the conversation, right? Taking a bit more ownership, expanding the domain in which people are working.
Yeah. As a human, I really believe that's our imperative. We essentially are still very valuable. And I'm not simply trying to justify the human species, but when you're hiring people, when you're organizing a team, think about the reasons that we haven't automated everything. What are those reasons? There are many jobs that should not exist from an organizational perspective. But there is still fundamentally a reason you have a team, and you should not only respect the team for that, but also hire for those strengths.
Yep. Let's take a quick peek into the future. And I know crystal balls are always murky and foggy, and we don't really have them. If we had this conversation again in 3 years or 5 years' time, what do you think would be different about your leadership? And again, not title, not role, not company, but what do you think might be your next evolution of leadership?
I think leadership is going to inevitably become more strategic. I don't say that just for myself. I say that for the industry at large. I think that is the effect of accessible, pervasive automation. I think that could be a positive effect. And so I think in 5 years, we won't be having the conversation of what is the best way to manage a development workflow, for example. I look forward to that day because nobody wants to manage a development workflow. I don't think that absolves us of doing a thing. And I think that that's something that a lot of businesses fail to grasp, particularly when it's hypeful and, kind of trendy to feel like we can automate everything or, that AI is going to absolve us of existing. But that isn't the fact. If you want to run a business, you have to do a thing. And hopefully that thing didn't consist of development workflows, which it probably would. Like, it's likely that thing consisted of this object needs to get on a truck and be transported to this other place. Like, that probably was value, and that's enduring value. That object will still need to be somewhere. And so I feel like that's what leadership, 5 years from now is going to include. Not that it doesn't today, but that right now there's all of this administrata around some of that that I believe will become significantly less.
Yeah, I got it. Okay. Let me ask you one last question and then we'll wrap it up, David. If you were to capture your leadership as a mantra or as a short statement, some philosophical headline or some bumper sticker, something like that, what would that be? And it can be aspirational.
Anything that you give an order on, you're going to have to always give an order on. So seriously consider how many orders you give and give people the freedom to do a job professionally, and then also give them the accountability to that job. So minimalism and careful strategic leadership is my recommendation.
Oh, interesting. Minimalistic leadership. Okay.
Yeah, you have to know what's important to actually worry about, because otherwise you will fail to delegate, and failing to delegate because you're too neurotic, because you want to give orders about everything, that just isn't going to work out for you at scale. So.
Right, that's not going to play out. Nice. Yeah. David, thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure having you here. One thing that will resonate for a long time will be the distinction that you made right at the beginning between what is possible and managing constraints and how they need to come together at some point, and many other nuggets. So thank you so much, David, for being with us today.
Thanks for having me.
To everyone else out there, please remember to like, subscribe, and comment. And most importantly, join us again for our next episode of the Top Innovator Series. And until then, keep your brain cells active.